The Fellowship of the Ring. They are some of the most beloved characters in The Lord of the Rings, and I reckon you guys all know what they do in that story. But what you might not know is what they do after. So in today's video, we will explore the fates of the Fellowship after the ending of the final book. Maya Gavana Melanin Amenek Swilaid. My name's Rainbow Dave, and welcome to another Tolkien Untangled lore video. So, I know I just said that we'll explore the fates of the Fellowship in this video, but you don't need me to tell you that not all 9 of them make it to the end of the story. Boromir, he is the obvious example, but also don't forget that in the final chapter of the final book, both Gandalf and Frodo sail west, and they depart Middle-earth. They depart the story. And although it is very, very cool, and it's wonderfully heartwarming to speculate on what they were getting up to in the Undying Lands, it is only speculation. Tolkien simply doesn't tell us. But of the 6 who remain, yeah, their fates are actually exceptionally well documented. And I feel like knowing what happens to these awesome heroes after The Lord of the Rings gives me such a deeper appreciation for all of them. Tolkien does a fantastic job at giving us closure. So, in the next week's video, I'll talk all about what Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli were getting up to at the end of the books, but in this video, I'm going to focus on the hobbits, on Sam and Pippin and Merry, and I will begin specifically with Sam, perhaps Tolkien's most beloved character. And guys, I reckon his story is probably the most feel-good thing that you are going to hear all day. It is so beautiful. And the first person to talk about in regards to the rest of Sam's life is Rosie, or Rose Cotton, the woman who waited for Sam. And although Rosie doesn't actually appear on the page until the end of The Return of the King, her and Sam do go back quite a long way. We are told that they were children together, and the Gamgee siblings would often play with the Cotton Boys and their sister Rosie down by the Bywater pool. Now, I don't imagine Sam did much swimming in that pool. We all know that staying afloat is not his greatest talent, but it is those childhood days with Rosie and her brothers that Sam's mind flashes back to as he stands in the shadow of Mount Doom as the night of Mordor closes in. Anyway, if we fast forward 221 days from Sam and Frodo's ascent of Mount Doom, we'll come to the day that the hobbits finally return to Bywater, and Rosie is finally reunited with Sam. And I think it's important to note just how long Rosie waited for Sam, because remember, Sam, originally he left the Shire on the 23rd of September in the year 3018, for what Rosie, and at the time he also, believed was just a trip to Crick Hollow, only a few days' journey from Bag End. But then, of course, 4 days later, Sam decides to accompany Frodo into the Old Forest, and this marks the true beginning of the quest that eventually took him all the way to the Cracks of Doom and back again. And so Rosie waited. Yule came and went, spring came and went, but Sam still didn't return. And if you've read the books, you'll know that after the summer of 3019, ruffians led by Saruman invaded the Shire. Rosie's family farm on South Lane was surrounded by these evil men, but still, she waited for Sam. And as it goes, Sam did not return to Bywater until the 2nd of November. He was gone for over a year. Most of the hobbits must surely have assumed that he was dead, but Rosie kept faith. In fact, when Rosie and Sam are finally reunited in the midst of this conflict with the ruffians, the scouring of the Shire, Rosie says to Sam, "They said you were dead, but I've been expecting you since the spring." Now, at this point in the story, I have to give major props to Frodo, because he basically turns into the world's best wingman in bigging up Sam to Rosie. She says to Frodo, "I hope my Sam's behaved himself," to which Frodo says, "He's now one of the most famous people in all the lands, and they are making songs about his deeds from here to the sea and beyond the great river." Not long after that, Sam and Rosie are married. And they actually take a new surname. Forever after, Sam and his family are known not as Gamgee, but as Gardener. And the reason for that is awesome too. So, as you'll know, Sam was a gardener, and his gift from Galadriel was a garden box containing a silver seed and soil from Lothlorien's orchards. Now, what I find so interesting about Galadriel's gift to Sam is that it's completely useless to the quest that they're all going on. You know, Legolas, he gets a new bow that he uses throughout the story. Aragorn gets a new scabbard that does come in handy. Frodo gets the Phial of Galadriel that comes in very handy. But Sam, he gets a box of dirt. And he can't use this box of dirt until after the quest is complete. And I think this is a big deal. I think it symbolizes hope that Sam will one day be a gardener again. And it represents Galadriel's foresight. She knows that the quest to destroy evil will not be enough unless afterwards someone like Sam can make the world grow again. And that's exactly what he does. After Saruman's scouring of the Shire and his pathetic death at the hands of Grima Wormtongue, Sam plants all these new saplings in the places where great and beloved trees once stood before they were cut down by ruffians. And at the root of each sapling, Sam sprinkles soil from the golden wood. And in the spot where Bilbo's party tree once stood, Sam plants that silver seed. And in spring, it surpassed his wildest hopes. A beautiful young sapling leapt up. It had silver bark and burst into golden flowers. The only Malorn west of the mountains and east of the sea. Which I find especially amazing if we remember that Lothlorien, the original home of the Malorn trees in Middle-earth, was made fair in part by the power of Galadriel's ring. A power that faded when the ruling ring was destroyed. And so the beauty of Lothlorien diminished. But thanks to Sam, that beauty was not lost. A tree of the golden wood grew in the Shire. And for that, Sam's family became known as Gardener. But just like his master Frodo, Sam does also struggle at first to readjust to Shire life after his world-changing quest. And he experiences this feeling of being torn in two. Obviously, he loves Rosie very, very much, but he also obviously loves Frodo very much, and he feels this conflicting obligation to stay by Frodo's side, whilst also being a husband to Rosie. Now, luckily, this conflict is assuaged by Frodo, when he invites Sam and Rosie to come live with him at Bag End. And it is in Bag End that Sam and Rosie have their first child, Eleanor. And I want to take a moment to talk about that name, Eleanor. It was suggested by Frodo, and I think it's a really lovely coming together of Sam's conflicted nature. It's these two parts being made whole. So, obviously Eleanor is a common name in the real world, but it's spelled differently to Eleanor. Eleanor is a Sindarin name. Anor means the sun, and El means star. But Eleanor is also an elven name for the star-shaped golden flowers that grew in abundance in Lothlorien, flowers that both Frodo and Sam particularly enjoyed during their stay there. And so I think Eleanor is the perfect combination of like an exquisite elven name, but it is also just a simple flower name, like Rosie's, like so many other hobbit lasses. Anyway, Eleanor is born on the 25th of March, and the date of her birth is an auspicious one for two reasons. Firstly, it is the 2-year anniversary of the fall of Barad-dûr, of the destruction of the ring. But also, according to the calendars of Gondor, it is the first day of the 4th age. Now, Eleanor is the only child of Sam's that Frodo ever meets, but she is far from Sam's only child. In fact, Sam and Rosie end up having 13 children, which we're specifically told beats the previous record of most babies born to a single woman in the whole Shire. And that's a very cool claim to fame for Rosie to have, because if we look at the dates that each of her children were born, we basically see that Rosie was either pregnant or breastfeeding for 21 years straight. 21 years! She was 91 when her youngest child finally came of age. Anyway, although fatherhood is obviously a huge part of Sam's life after the departure of Frodo and Gandalf, he does also find time for quite a few other endeavours in the Shire. When Frodo sails west, he gives Sam the Red Book, and he also makes Sam the Master of Bag End, which is just really cool because when we first meet Sam, he was the gardener of Bag End. Now, I know I said that this video is all about what happens after The Lord of the Rings, but to be honest, most of what I've talked about so far is actually just takes place in the last few chapters. But with Frodo now gone, we can exclusively move into the appendices and start exploring what happened after the official ending of the story. So after inheriting Bag End, Sam decides to try his hand at politics, which might seem a little bit out of character, although I feel like Hobbit politics is probably not as cutthroat as it is in our real world. Anyway, in the 6th year of the 4th Age, Sam was elected Mayor of the Shire, which during his rule became a really important position. In fact, we're told that King Elessar, aka Aragorn, decreed that the Mayor of the Shire would be made a councillor to the North Kingdom of the Dunedain, a councillor of Arnor. And Aragorn even rode all the way to the border of the Shire to award Sam with a silver brooch called the Star of the Dunedain. And we can certainly speculate that Sam was a very popular mayor. He was re-elected 7 times and he served 7 consecutive 7-year terms. That's 49 years as mayor. Although I will point out that during the first year of his 3rd term, Sam made his brother-in-law deputy mayor, and he left him in charge while Sam brought Rosie and their children on a great journey away from the Shire, all the way to Gondor. In fact, Sam's youngest son was probably born in Gondor, and the Gamgee family, or I guess I should say the Gardner family, spent well over a year in Minas Tirith as cherished guests of King Elessar and Queen Arwen Evenstar. In fact, Eleanor was even given the opportunity to become a maid of honor to Arwen herself. Imagine how cool that would be for a young hobbit. Anyway, when the Gardner family did finally return to the Shire, both Sam and Rosie were getting on in years, and when Eleanor came of age and she took a hobbit called Fastred of Greenholm as her husband, Sam used his political clout one last time. He approached the Thane of the Shire, which is an office of great respect and possibly like the closest thing hobbits really have to royalty. And by the way, it turns out this Thane of the Shire is none other than Pippin. Anyway, Sam asked Pippin to make his son-in-law Fastred the Warden of Westmarch. Now this is probably a little bit nepotistic, but it's Sam, you know? If Sam Gamgee asks you to do a favour, you do it. And so forever after, Eleanor and Fastred's line held the title Warden of Westmarch. And what's especially cool about this is that the lands of Westmarch, where they moved to, they were never originally part of the Shire. The lands of Westmarch were given as a gift to the hobbits by Aragorn in the 31st year of the 4th Age, and these lands stretch almost as far as the Grey Havens. They encompass, among other places, the Tower Hills, which were originally elven outposts built by King Gil-galad in the 2nd Age. It was from the Tower Hills that the wandering elves of Gillador in Glorion's company were returning in Fellowship of the Ring. Until the end of the 3rd Age, the Palantir of Elos Tyrion was kept in the Tower Hills. That's the only Palantir that can look into the uttermost west. So I think it's just an incredibly wonderful detail that in the 4th Age, these ancient elven towers are inhabited and governed by the descendants of Samwise Gamgee's firstborn child. What an amazing legacy for such a humble character. But, of course, nothing lasts forever, and on Mid-Year's Day, in the 61st year of the 4th Age, Sam's happy life in the Shire finally came to an end. At the age of 98, Rosie died. Only 3 months later, Sam departed the Shire for the final time. He travelled west towards the Grey Havens, but he stopped first at the Tower Hills, and there he bestowed the Red Book of Westmarch to his daughter Eleanor. And we are specifically told that Eleanor was the last person ever to see Samwise Gamgee on the shores of Middle-earth. Once upon a time, he was briefly a ring-bearer, and so Sam shares their fate, and he followed Bilbo and Mr. Frodo into the bliss of the uttermost west, where nothing more is told of his story. Isn't that lovely? I can think of no character more deserving of such a happy ending. And it is an ending. I know the Undying Lands implies a place where its residents can't die, but that's a misconception. Both Frodo and Sam are mortals, and thus they must eventually die. And when they do, their spirits will depart Arda, and they will join Rosie and Bilbo beyond the circles of the world. So anyway, that's the story of Samwise, but he is not, of course, the only hobbit in the Fellowship to return to the Shire after a life-changing quest. And so let's now turn our attention to the fates of Meriadoc Brandybuck and Peregrine Took. So after the scouring of the Shire, Merry and Pippin were legit hobbit heroes. I mean, obviously all 4 of the hobbits were heroes, but Merry and Pippin are something else. During the final conflict against Saruman, it was Pippin who went off to Tookland to raise the Tooks in rebellion, and it was Merry's horn that roused 200 Bucklanders to fight with him in the uprising. Merry and Pippin were the joint captains in the Battle of Bywater. It was Merry who slew the leader of the ruffians, and Pippin who brought the reinforcements that won the day. Now, there were, of course, quite a few hobbits who fought in the liberation of the Shire, but not one of them can compare to Merry or Pippin. Meriadoc the Magnificent, as he became known, was an esquire of Rohan, and Pippin, heir to the mighty Took dynasty, was a knight of Gondor. They both wore their respective uniforms when they returned to the Shire, but that's not the only part of their appearance that marked them out. Don't forget, Merry and Pippin are probably the only 2 hobbits ever to have drunk the waters of an Ent draft. And as I'm sure you know, Ent draft makes its drinkers taller. It added 3 inches or more to their heights, and so by the end of the story, Merry and Pippin are the 2 tallest hobbits ever recorded in Shire history. They're even taller than Pippin's mighty ancestor Bulroratook, who was so famously big that he could ride a horse. They must have towered over the average hobbit. So, after the final end of the War of the Ring, Merry and Pippin returned to the lives that they'd left behind when they joined Frodo's quest over a year ago. Merry inherited his father's title as the Master of Buckland, and over the years he retained his reputation as an adventurer and a traveller. He received kingly gifts from his dear friends Eomer and Eowyn. He wrote scholarly articles about the lands outside of the Shire, which greatly contributed to the hobbit knowledge of elves and lore and history, and he even journeyed back to Rivendell more than once. At the time that Sam was made Councillor of the North Kingdom by Aragorn, Merry and Pippin were also awarded that same distinction. And when it comes to Pippin's fate, one could perhaps argue that his life after the ending is even more magnificent than Merry's. But to understand who Pippin grew into, I think we first need to understand where he came from. Because although it's not hugely important in the books, and it's not even mentioned in the movies, Pippin is an incredibly well-to-do hobbit even before he ever leaves the Shire. He is the firstborn son of Thane Paladin Took, and so he's the heir of what is by far the most powerful hobbit dynasty in Middle-earth. The Tooks are a really big deal. And when Pippin left all of that behind and he journeyed off into the wilds with Frodo, where many hobbits would have assumed he perished, Pippin wasn't even considered an adult. Hobbits don't come of age until they turn 33, and Pippin is only 28 in Fellowship of the Ring. So when he returned a year later as a guard of the citadel of Minas Tirith, he still hadn't come of age. More so than any other member of the Fellowship, Pippin got pretty much all of his character development out of the way really early on in life, and then he just sort of went back to living a long life of exquisite wealth and privilege. When he was 37, he married a hobbit lady called Diamond of Longcleave, and together they had a son called Faramir Took. When he was 44, Pippin succeeded his father, and he became the 32nd Thane of the Shire. He constructed an immense library, probably with the help of Merry, and he filled the Hobbit history books with knowledge of Númenor and the heirs of Elendil and the histories of the Second and Third Ages. So pretty much single-handedly, Merry and Pippin enlightened the entire Shire with previously unknown knowledge of the outside world. However, after 50 years of ruling and travelling, the day finally came for Merry and Pippin to set off on one final adventure. When Merry was old, but still hale, he received a letter from old King Éomer. It was an invitation, or perhaps more accurately, a request for Merry to return to Rohan to visit the king one last time before he died. And so, at the age of 102, Merry resigned his office and he left his estate to his son. Pippin, who was 94, did the same. And together, they left the Shire and they journeyed off into the lands of the big folk for the last time. Neither would ever see the Shire again. But Merry and Pippin did successfully make it all the way to Rohan, and there they were gladly met by King Éomer Eodig, the now 93-year-old king of the Riddermark. And Merry and Pippin stayed in Edoras with Éomer until the autumn. After 65 years as king, that's the second longest reign in Rohan's history, Éomer eventually died, and the throne was inherited by his son, Elfwine the Fair. After Éomer's funeral, Merry and Pippin ventured off once again, this time into the lands of Gondor and to the city of Minas Tirith. And guys, in Minas Tirith, Merry and Pippin were reunited not only with Aragorn, but with all three of the hunters who'd united 65 years earlier to rescue them from the Uruk-hai. And it's the fates of Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli that I'll talk about in the next video, but I'll finish this video in Minas Tirith, where Merry and Pippin lived out what short years were left to them in the company of King Elessar and Queen Arwen. And when these two legendary hobbits did finally die, they were afforded an honour previously reserved only for the kings and stewards of Gondor. Their bodies were laid to rest along the silent street of Rath-Dinen, and there they remained for 57 years. After that, their beds were moved further down the street, and both Merry and Pippin were set beside the body of Aragorn himself. I guess from their very first introduction, the characters of Sam and Merry and Pippin represent the ordinary folk living in an extraordinary world, and yet there is nothing ordinary about their fates after the story finishes. Over the course of only about 6 months really, Sam, Merry and Pippin turn from these parochial civilians to heroes of Middle-earth. In the long decades that follow, they are remembered for the magnitude of their deeds, and they are rewarded appropriately. When we consider where the hobbits end up in life, I think it recontextualizes the story of how they got there. Sam began his life as a gardener, yet he is later remembered as the patriarch of a dynasty. Merry and Pippin begin as mischievous cousins, but they end up lying forever beside the High King of the Dúnedain. It adds an extra dimension of gravity to this scene from the movies.
My friends, you bow to no one.
So, in the next video, I'll talk all about the life and reign of Aragorn, as well as the fates of his awesome buddies, Legolas and Gimli. So be sure to check that out next week, as it'll probably be the last video I upload, at least for a little while. But until then, guys, thank you all very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, give it a like and a comment, and be sure to hit the subscribe button to make sure you don't miss future videos. And as always, until next time, my dear friends, much love. Stay groovy, and Nevia Melanine.